welcome everybody to our next session, which is called Just Transition, Yet Another Buzzword. And we're going to have a little bit of a panel discussion and go through different topics, and then in the end, open up for a conversation with the audience in the kind of last 20-ish minutes of the time that we have. Thank you all very much for coming, and let me first introduce our panelists. So over there we have Giada Giacomini, who holds a PhD in public comparative and international law, and is currently a postdoc working on a joint research project between the European University Institute and ESGD, the Graduate Institute in Geneva. The project is about just transition and grievance redress mechanisms, and she has published widely on that topic and is a member of different international environmental networks and research institutions. Then right to my left, we have Mark Höfti. He nods, so it's a good sign, who is a professor in development studies at ESGD and is also a senior researcher at the Center for International Environmental Studies. His teaching and research focus on environmental governance applied to different issues such as nature conservation and biodiversity. And he has co-published several papers on justice in lithium extraction in South America, which is something that we're going to focus on a little bit in the second part of the conversation. Then we have Gilles Cabonnier, who is a professor of development economics and whose research focus in economics has been on humanitarian crises and responses, on the intersection between energy, commodity, and commodity trade and development, and international development cooperation. And he's in the final stages of a project on this phase of the project on curbing illicit financial flows from research-rich developing countries. And then we have Jennifer Hall, who is a lecturer at the University of Ghana School of Law, and whose research focuses on international law and human rights law, third world approaches to international law, and business and criminal law. And my first question to all of our panelists is if you can just in under 3 minutes, let us know what lies for you at the core of just transition, which is, you know, a big task, but we're going to come back to this a couple of times. So why don't we start with Mark and then just go through the row, and everybody can tell us what it means in their research or in their work. So Mark.
Okay, obviously, I will start by saying that this is complex. It is complex because the energy transition touches everybody. And of course, the question is if this transition will change things and what will it change? So there are going to be some losers and some winners in this transition. And obviously, depending on the level, I'm working, for example, on the supply chain of lithium, very narrowly from South America. And you can already see that there are people who are winning and others who are losing. So that's a bit my focus.
So for me, coming from a developing country, my concern when it comes to just transition has to do with how we balance our homegrown solutions to the need to actually get aid for just transition. So basically, I believe that we should have more homegrown solutions as a country or as a continent than just focusing on getting aid to support just transition. Yes, thank you.
Well, building on what Mark and Jennifer have said, it's clear that this energy transition will redistribute massively costs and benefits and risk and opportunities between and within countries. And I was just struck by some figures provided by the IMF over, looking at what were the proceeds of fossil fuels over the past 20 years. And the number is over 70 trillion US dollars, which was over 25 times more than the proceeds from the minerals that are today so-called critical minerals to fuel the energy transition. And if we look at the next 20 years, and we look at the so-called objective of net zero by 2050, then they have a scenario where energy transition minerals would generate 13 trillion US dollars of proceeds for mainly low-income countries where you have most of these critical minerals located, and only 20 or 19 trillions for fossil fuel producers, many of whom are also developing countries. And there will be a lot of redistributive issues, a lot of issues related to incentives, compensations. And I think when we speak of just transition, it involves all of that. And as much as I agree with you, Jennifer, that homegrown solutions are key, and as you say, rightly so, across the continent, African solutions for Africa, as much as I think that international cooperation will be also key to find new rules of the games that are able to absorb this shock and redistribute costs and benefits in a fair manner.
Well, in my research, the just transition has at least two main meanings. The first meaning I'm thinking about when I think about the just transition is, of course, the rights of the workers and all these people that actually work in the fossil fuel industry. So how can we ensure a just transition for these people that do have all their revenues from non-renewable energy sources? So that is a big social problem, a big policy problem, and also a legal problem. On the other hand, the just transition also means protecting the rights of people, communities, and also the rights of nature in projects that involve the environment. For example, solar power farms, wind farms, dams, and also nature conservation projects, because there are many projects at the international level that aim at mitigating climate change by conserving nature. And this project can affect people, can affect the self-determination rights of the people, and also procedural rights and participatory rights. So in my research, I'm looking at the human rights impact of just transition and the environmental impact of the just transition, and how can we provide remedies and legal solutions and policy solutions.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to start the session off with this quick round because I think it illustrates one point really well, and actually 2 points. One is that this session we want to look at a little bit more of a macro perspective on what just transition means in very different legal, economic, and political contexts. And then secondly, as we already saw now, the increasing popularity of the term, of course, like again pushed forward by having it mentioned in the Paris Climate Agreement, has led to this rapid expansion of meanings that we've also seen here, and like already between our 4 panelists, a plethora of opinions on what it means and how we can achieve it. So this is something that we want to explore a little bit more today. And then I'm very happy that most of you actually already mentioned this, because I thought we can front load with one of these discussions we can probably talk about for the next 2 hours in and of itself. But of course, you know that one of the main points of critique along the line about just transition is a question of, isn't it just another global north framework that we are taking somewhere and then we see what happens, or that we are pushing on people? And I'm very curious to understand your take on that. Maybe first off, Jennifer and Gilles, coming out of just yesterday, they had a one-day conference for this big research project that they're also part of, and to kind of understand more your take on that.
So for me, like I was saying, it's important to balance the need for international cooperation and help when it comes to achieving just transition, and then the need to have homegrown solutions to ensure that African countries, or even from where I come from, Ghana is able to address the whole change from high carbon to low carbon. So and also because coming from our end, we are highly dependent on fuel, and that's the means by which we make a lot of revenue. Because in Ghana, for instance, about a quarter of our export revenue is from the export of oil and gas. So because we are highly dependent on that, it's important for us to actually not just wait for the international community to provide us solutions. Because at COP 2026, for instance, the president of Ghana mentioned that the international community had promised to give our country about $10 billion to help support just transition. And that because that wasn't coming, then it has affected our work towards implementing policies or homegrown solutions to ensure that. So the problem, therefore, as I see it, is that if we are going to start from wanting the international community to provide us with aid before we can actually start doing certain things or putting in place certain measures to ensure that we support just transition, then we'll be having a problem. That's why I insist that we should have a plan as a country to ensure that we could actually also effectively transit into using low carbon energy. Thank you.
Yeah, building up a bit on what you said, Jennifer, which is so true, and referring to the yesterday's authors workshop where we were a bit concluding a 6-year research project with the University of Ghana and many others on illicit financial flows related to commodity exploitation and exports. It's really striking, just to portray a bit the phenomenon. If you look at the latest report of the Global Financial Integrity think tank in Washington, they say, well, trade mispricing resulted basically is about 2% of the world's GDP of resources or financial flows that are siphoned off the system that do not benefit states in terms of revenue mobilization. And if you look just at developing countries, the number just for 2018, which is the latest year for which we have data, is about $850 billion. And that year it's over 5 times the total official development assistance that was available. So it's massive. And then, of course, we can debate at length, as we do with commodity traders and states, the fact that the methodology is flawed, that the data is not accurate, and that the numbers may be very different. And it's true. And through hardcore research, we can detect what are the main channels and what is the volume of trade mispricing, on abusive transfer pricing that reduces the tax base of developing countries that export these critical minerals, that export also fossil fuels, and they don't have this ability to mobilize domestic resources out of their natural resources to fund first the SDGs. We have forgotten about the SDGs, but a couple of years ago, we said it's trillions that we need every year, and it's still needed. Plus, we have the climate change agenda and climate change adaptation, especially for low-income countries, which also requires trillions of dollars. And aid won't do the trick. It will be marginal. So we need to enable countries to mobilize domestic resources. So just, if I may, an anecdote, when we started the project, we were in Ghana in 2018. And we went to the revenue authority and all the people had T-shirts to say, our taxes, our future. I said, wow, I'd love to have that in Switzerland, you know, our taxes, our future. And the motto was Ghana beyond aid and Africa beyond aid. It was a vision. I know the situation post-COVID at present, and also with the impact of the Ukraine conflict is bleak in many countries with regard to reserves, inflation, and all the rest of the macroeconomic indicators, including indebtedness. So it's extremely complex, but still the issues remain and are even more valid than ever. So what we are looking at is how to change with a number of policy and regulatory reforms and a number of short-term, medium-term, long-term action, how we can actually reduce the scope for illicit financial flows so that this new rush on energy transition minerals does not result in yet another resource curse for the countries that have those minerals. And there are options out there. They are, at least at the level of discourses, a broad consensus for, you know, a big push towards more transparency. Now, when it comes to the nitty-gritty of what transparency on what becomes a bit more vivid conversations, but then there is a more mid-term to long-term basic reforms of the global tax governance regimes that need to be undertaken, and this is up for extremely important negotiations. And I feel that African states and African researchers and academics are much more aware nowadays with the Africa Task Force on Finance and Africa Tax Initiative to really push for a radical change in the system. And solutions are there. It's just a question of political will, and we can discuss it a bit later.
So as always, it's just a question of political will. I think that this actually brings us quite nicely into the area of what is needed in terms of capacity building. So for implementation. So in terms of, I would like to hear your opinion, and maybe also Mark can come in and discuss some of his experiences from with regards to South America on this, in terms of finance and in terms of technology. So what type of capacity building in these two areas do you see as the most pressing? So this can either be, you know, like maybe also reform around, we now talked about taxation, but also subsidy reform, these types of things that are connected to finance, of course, but also in terms of technology transfer. Yeah, so maybe if we start with Mark, and then we can, whoever wants to go next can go next.
Maybe a word on this, the South and the North and the global competition. This is one level where the energy transition is very strongly changing things. You have basically two countries and one region, Europe, the US and China, who are kind of reorganizing the world to suit their interests, which is precisely energy transition for different reasons, no? But there is a say that when elephants make love, it's the grass that suffers, and when they fight, it's also the grass that suffers. So the small countries or developing countries or the global South will, in a way, suffer, as we see, no? And they don't have responsibility. So this is one level of injustice. They don't have the responsibility of climate change, but they will, of course, suffer the consequences, no, in different forms. And one form is the energy transition. I would say you should go down one level. I'm not sure I'm competent to talk subsidies and taxes, but if you take South America, no, you have something very strong now, which is a debate on the national interest of, let's say, because that's the countries I'm working on, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia. No, should they be providers of for example, lithium because and copper for Chile, should they continue provide, or should they develop some kind of autonomous industry? Because if you would like to develop such an economy, you have to invent everything, or you have to have technical transfer to the country. How do you build a battery industry that is highly sophisticated? And cars, they don't produce much cars, they produce parts of thermic cars, etc. How do you switch to this new transition economy? I'd say maybe Chile is better placed than Argentina and than Bolivia, but this is a problem. And you have, as you always had in South America, a discussion on this is our resources. We should not let the North make the most of these resources, lithium or copper, and we should have a national economy based on the transition, etc. So you have this debate. No, this is a very classical debate. But for that, you need a policy. You need an industrial policy. Europe is finally taking off with some kind of energy policy, industrial policy. But how can a small country do that autonomously is a question that is left. So you were saying aid, but it's more than aid. It's also technical transfer, etc. So this is not easy. And these countries, this is now the far west. Many companies are getting in and trying to appropriate the reserves of lithium, etc. So there are elephants are fighting.
Okay, so to build on what Mark was saying, Ghana came up with an energy transition framework in 2022. And if you look at that framework, some of the things that are stipulated is, for instance, to have electronic cars by 2050. And I'm wondering, this is a country where even for cooking, a lot of people still use firewood to cook. So you are then wondering, how are we even going to achieve that? This is a country where, for instance, even getting internet access is still a very, very big problem. So it looks like even though we have a framework, the ambitions are just too high. They are just, they're just too high. They're just above us. And we have not actually thought of putting in place what we need to do to achieve that. It's easy to come up with a framework and make stipulations that by this particular year, we are going to achieve A, B, C, D, and then be waiting and depending for aid from the global north, or be waiting for technology transfer from the global north to achieve these things. So I also believe that even though on paper we could put together something, we need to actually work to ensure that we make provisions and ensure that we can actually actively transition.
Regarding these just transition issues and problems, what I would like to do in my research in a theoretical way is also to take a stand in criticizing this extractivism through also critical legal theory, maybe through adopting an approach that criticizes the just transition as a very Western concept, because what I see is that that somehow we wish to apply the same mechanism of very the development of very individualistic, capitalistic mind to the transition to a low carbon economy. But are we sure that this is the solution? Are we sure that we can fight the climate change with electric cars and with lithium mining, or by deploying the resources in developing countries? Although I don't, I don't know if it's even like a term that can be used in these circumstances. So yeah, just to make a quick point about also seeing the implicit criticism that can be built within the same concept of just transition, and maybe we can expand on that in the course of this panel.
So I think that actually a couple of quite good points just came up. And for those of you who are from Geneva, you know this. For those of you who are guests in this town, you will have seen this probably. Geneva is one of these places where almost everybody who rides a bike has an electric bike by now of some sort, either the slow electric bike or the fast ones. And I almost brought my battery for today's meeting. Because I think that it is one of the things that has come up now in different answers, that in a way we sit here in Geneva, we feel like we're really doing something for energy transition by riding our electric bike, and we feel very good because it means we didn't take the car in the morning. But actually, if we, and I want to go back to Mark's research project also with this, who Mark is working on lithium extraction and what these types of green minerals and the commodity chains around them, whether the discourses of just transition can actually transform relationships between Europe and South America in this case. And I want to push a little bit on this and ask you whether you see that there is actually space for recreating properly any of these relationships, or isn't it just a replacement of current dynamics with basically the same type of dynamics, but we call them something else?
Thank you. I'm looking at different levels, no? I mentioned the global level. Now we could go to the national level and the local level. Of course, lithium is a mineral, so it has to come from somewhere. And in South America, which is not the case in Australia, Australia is the main provider of lithium in the present times, maybe 40% of the total of the extraction of lithium, but this is a different process for extraction and maybe different dynamic. In South America, lithium is extracted mostly from salares. These are salt flats in the Altiplano. And in some of them, there are people living there. And in others, maybe you have less people or you don't have people there. But there are two actors not very often mentioned, no? When I was saying the elephants are fighting or making love, or when they negotiate prices and everything, well, it has to be extracted from somewhere. So it is being extracted from these places, and these places are very special because these are deserts. So it rains very little, and there is a very specific and very original biodiversity there. You have microbian and maybe birds and everything. It is very special, and people over the centuries, they have developed a very special relation with their environment. Of course, they are making the most of their environment. And then suddenly it was the most remote place in the world, and suddenly you have plenty of companies, people interested in their lands and resources. They extracted salt, for example. They had llama, and there are places where you can feed your llama. Okay, now they are saying the let's say the best companies have goodwill. That is, they come there and they offer people, you will receive compensation, you will receive money. But what happens when the community receives money? They used to have very little money. So they are receiving a lot of money for, and this is said to be a good arrangement. No, you get money. So it is destroying these communities because the young people, they only think of going to the cities, buying motorbike, TVs, etc. And the old people are seeing their communities being divided, and they regret the good old times, of course. But these communities are exploding under the demand. So we think we are doing something good. No, we change. We have. I also have an e-bike. You know, I came with my e-bike or a e-car, and we are doing good for the environment. So this is something. But we rarely look at the nature at the local level, or those people who will see their life changed, sometime for the better, sometime for the worse, at the local level. So you really have to look at these levels. And one of the main issues is water, of course, because these are dry places. And extracting lithium, I won't go into the technicals, but uses much water. So this is what the fight is about now, locally speaking. No, these are some. Yeah.
So I saw Jada nodding a couple of times. So maybe you want to expand a little bit on whether you think that that we can actually recreate something coming out of just transition, or whether we are just replacing current hierarchies with different inequalities.
Yeah, so first, I didn't want to criticize people having electric bikes or electric cars. It was just more of a systemic question, you know, on this overall just transition and the alternatives to the fossil fuel cars. So that was my point. Yeah, so I totally agree with Mark, and especially on the issue of compensation, because we think that compensation and money can actually compensate in a fair way people, but this is a very Western concept again. I've been working a lot on the issue of the rights of indigenous peoples and international law, and sometimes compensation and remedies can be intended in a very different way. So when we destroy nature and biodiversity, and when we destroy cultures because we take the land from them, and these people do identify themselves with the land, what is even a just transition on just compensation in that case? And I think that's these points can really raise some issue around the whole system. And again, we can see how the just transition is being defined by Western values that really can put a price on human rights, that can put a price on the land, that they can put a price on the self-determination of the people. So I don't have any answers, because I'm trying to wrap my head around this concept, but it is good and fair if we interrogate ourselves on the meaning of what we want to do with the just transition, and also on the meaning of nature and natural resources for us as humankind. And we need to ask ourselves if we want to keep going with the concept of development that is based on nature exploitation, or we think that we need to move beyond this concept and embrace another conceptualization or even development. Yeah, this is what I wanted to say. It's very complicated, but I'm just giving some ideas.
Jennifer, who is our other lawyer on the panel, do you have something to add from your legal research, from that perspective, kind of complementing maybe some stuff that that Jada mentioned in terms of human rights from more of a business law perspective, maybe?
Okay, so what I would like to add is that there's an existing framework that is requiring businesses now to respect human rights. So now there's this emerging area. I'll call it emerging because it's a relatively new area of human rights that has to do with requiring that businesses respect human rights. So that you have the UN guiding principles and then also the principle of due diligence that requires that businesses apply due diligence principles in carrying out their activities in various countries. So I think we could actually learn from the framework and then implement those in the just transition process. Yes.
And to bring us, thank you very much to these insights. So I want to, Gilles, at the very beginning in our little introductory round of what does just transition mean, spoke a little bit about the risks and the opportunities that come with the framework of just transition. And I want to go back a little bit to that, seeing that we are also in Geneva. So of course we have the ILO, who has the just transition guidelines, of which, you know, of course, also Ghana is one of the pilot countries. And we have, you know, so many other forums and international organizations in Geneva that are debating around concepts of just transition. What do you see in Geneva as the risk and the opportunities? And how do we maybe need to change also some of the ways that we discuss some of these issues in this city?
Well, I think Geneva is a fantastic hub, bringing together, as we know, states as the second largest UN hub worldwide, but also with scientists and academia, with think tanks, with civil society and businesses. And throughout our 6 years of research, I mentioned before, we had on our international advisory group activists of civil society organizations, but also traders themselves and states. And it was very useful to come up with data and evidence and have traders say, no, actually, your data is meaningless because it's not the way it happens in reality. And when we are in special economic zones and when we deal with this, the way it's done is different and it doesn't show up in the data. So then, you know, you start a conversation, and it's a perfect hub to bring all these different views to try to first demystify a number of things, build a number of bridges to the extent possible, and then advance, I would say, a voice which is supposedly scientific and rigorous in trying to shed light on the issues and then some solutions. I think what you mentioned also, Giada, and it's very important also, Jennifer, is the question of reconsidering orthodoxy and solutions, and to say, well, is it the world we want? Do we want a radical departure? Do we want to reconsider radically a number of things? And how do we deal with a polycrisis, polycentric world where I think we are all agreeing that we have to make do with a neocolonialist approach and imperialistic approach, and to not anymore impose any vertical universalism, but to go much more through a horizontal, humble ways of trying to preserve a number of fundamental principles that are ingrained in every society, civilization, cultures, and religious traditions. And I think Geneva offers also, with the UN human rights group and work on indigenous populations, peoples, a venue. So this is great, but I think it's good at the Graduate Institute that we have a center on democracy, because I hear the contestation that we have, but what I also see in Nigeria, for instance, is that speak of removing an inch of a subsidy on fossil fuels and you get riots all over the place because you increase the cost of transport. And move anywhere in the world, and if a government wants to stay in place, they'd rather not enter into the type of conversation that are very nice to have in this room, but that are very difficult to lead. And I recall that you have a number of candidates today in very large and important countries that are openly anti-climate agenda and openly anti-energy transition and all the rest. So my impression is also that Geneva has a role to play there as a space, as a ground where we can, allow decent voices and try to bring this and overcome a number of barriers rather than building new barriers. Maybe the last point I want to build on the question of the UN guiding principles on the business and human rights, due diligence, and all of that. It's interesting because precisely about what Mark was saying about the elephants making more often fighting than love, you see that there are attempts to, different ways, and China and the US and others are bringing their own solution with regard to energy transition minerals. So you have this new US-led initiative, or so-called Minerals Security Partnership under the OECD, together with energy transition mineral producing countries, saying, well, let's try to improve the overall supply chain of energy transition minerals through transparency and so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. And that's a laudable initiative, but of course it is underpinned by the concerns of the elephants to secure their supply chains and to get a grip on major supply chains of these critical minerals. But I think there is also an opportunity there to say, okay, you have now this initiative launched June last year, so let's walk the talk. And we have an agenda on transparency. There is guiding principles under the UN, but we need to implement them in national legislation and in action in principle. And I think this would help redress some of the problems I have highlighted at the very beginning with regard to the redistribution of costs and benefits related to energy transition.
Thank you very much. I think there's, of course, a number of important points that came up. I think that especially the points around that we all have to live in this world, of course, where there's, or it seems to us at least that there is suddenly a lot more opinions coming to the forefront, and also understand that as a chance and as an opportunity to build something different. And I want to pick up on one of the points that you mentioned, which of course is that also very often the communities who are most at risk for whatever reason, and that can go from the communities that Mark mentioned in terms of extraction, but also of course in terms of communities where if we just say, oh, we should cut all of these subsidies, their transportation becomes unaffordable. So I think there is a very wide range of communities to consider here, and I want to turn to Jada, whose research is very much on grievance redress mechanisms. And I want you to maybe first talk a little bit about the different judicial avenues for all of these communities with very different constituencies and very different interests. And of course, there is grievance redress mechanisms, there's domestic courts also. There is, a lot of different avenues that people can go down. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that, and we can turn the conversation a bit that way.
So yeah, the just transition litigation can be brought at different levels. They can be, of course, domestic courts. They can be international courts, international human rights courts, for example. There are cases pending. However, what I'm focusing on is non-judicial, quasi-judicial mechanisms. In this specific moment, I'm looking at international organizations' accountability mechanisms. Why? Because we have international organizations that have a role in the just transition that is often overlooked, but it's totally in account of the issue of developing countries and the aid that Jennifer was was talking about, and in response to the principle of helping developing countries reaching the green transition. So I'm looking specifically at the Green Climate Fund, looking at the UNDP, and I'm also looking at the World Bank. And I'm looking at their grievance redress mechanisms, which are the accountability mechanisms of these organizations. Why do we need these mechanisms? Because international organizations operate in an immunity framework. Of course, immunity is very much needed by them because of their functional necessities. However, what happens when an international organization in implementing a green development project violates the rights of communities living in the area affected by the project? They cannot go to the court to have their claims heard, but they can file a claim at the grievance redress mechanism of the international organizations. And I am looking specifically at those complaints in the green development projects. These mechanisms are important because they are a very early stage type of complaint mechanisms. For example, in the Green Climate Fund, a community or an individual that is affected by a project can appeal the mechanism even if the project is has not been yet implemented. And this is very important because they set up a problem-solving type of proceeding. If this doesn't work, they can go into a review of an appraisal of the Green Climate Fund policies, because they have very specific policies, for example, in relation to the rights of indigenous peoples, the gender policy, environmental and social standards, and so on. And they can provide remedies. Of course, they are not like courts, they are quasi-judicial mechanisms. So then the board of the organizations or the directors of the organization have to decide what to do with this project. And I think that these grievance redress mechanisms are very useful also for corporate actors, because corporate actors operating in the lithium extraction or wind farms or solar power farms, they can institute a grievance redress mechanism within their organization to deal with the claims and to resolve them in a very swift way, and to listen to the communities at the project level. So I think that there can be a very doable way of dealing with the human rights and environmental impacts. And of course, a community can also file a complaint at the domestic level, at the court level. If this, if you file a complaint at a grievance redress mechanism, this is not impeding you to file a complaint also at the court. I hope to have explained myself. It's in this very brief talk. Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting thing. This is why I also really wanted you in this panel, because I think normally when we think about grievance redress mechanisms, we really think about companies very often and about some sort of corporate social responsibility. Whilst I think if moving this kind of conversation to a more IO specific realm can actually open up quite different ways for us to think about grievance redress mechanisms, and also about IO accountability. And going back to some of the conversations we had earlier in the panel about the, epistemologically, like where are we coming from with using these types of frameworks? I think that is something quite helpful to come back to. So I wanted to open up a little bit, because I saw some people nodding in the audience at different points in time, and to see if we have like a couple of questions that we can collect, so that we can actually also have answers to some of the questions and have a little bit of a conversation, and not one of these 5-minute rushed Q&As. Maybe if we start in the back and then...
Thank you. My name is Giovanna. I work in public health, but I'm very interested in the topic. So thank you very much to all of the presenters. Very quickly, I have a bunch of questions, but I'll try and be very brief. The first thing is, we talked about just transition, and I'm wondering, what is the vision? Just transition to what? And I'm sorry to be, playing the devil's advocate, but what I feel like it's somehow missing, or I'd like to hear more of, is where are we heading to? What's the vision? Where do we want to be in X years' time? And I like Jennifer, what you said about the energy transition framework in Ghana, where the vision is to have electric vehicles. Is that where really the country wants to go to? So to have a little bit more clarity on and not just in Ghana, but in general on that. And also I wanted to mention on what Jada, what you just said about the international organizations' internal grievance mechanisms. The question I have is, how do you ensure the independence of those mechanisms? Because they only respond to themselves. Thank you.
So I think that actually the first question on visions is particularly interesting if we also think a little bit about the history of just transition, because I feel like that is something that we very often forget about, and that that actually just transition was born out of labor movements, and that we ended up with this particular language around the issues that we use coming very much from a workers' grassroots approach. So maybe also keeping that in mind, that this is something that has been a term that has actually been used, buzzword or not, but since the 1950s in labor communities. I think this is a question to everybody, to be honest. So maybe we can do something similar to what we started with as the question, what is at the core of the just transition for you? To kind of gather some of to have also the overview of different views of where you think we're going. And because we started with Mark at the beginning, we're going to start with Jada now, I think.
Okay, so just, sorry.
Where is it going?
Yeah, that's the question of the questions. I think we are trying to figure this out. At least I'm talking from the legal perspective point of view. I'm attending a conference tomorrow on this in international law, so I hope to give you more answers next time. But yeah, as also Nina pointed out, like just transition was born for labor rights and people working in fossil fuels economy. But then, at least in what I'm doing in my research, has assumed the meaning of also just transition in the sense of due diligence, respecting human rights in the implementation of green development projects, in green mining, and so on. So for me, the just transition has to do with human rights and also environmental protection in the implementation of this transition towards a net zero emission world, a world where we tackle climate change. There are many different interpretations, I think.
If I can go on and engage in an interdisciplinary dialogue, we always have a very vivid conversations between lawyers, and I'm an economist coming from the dismal science, where we say all of this is very nice, but at the end of the day, how much does it cost? No, I'm kidding a bit, but it's of course, it's always important to have these different views. But I do agree with you, Jada, that if we have this conversation, where do we go with just transition to what? It's a bit what I was mentioning before, where I'm really worried of vertical universalism, where often we in the West think we know what is good, and we think we hold the key to universal values and the rest. And I think that's where this engagement of horizontally across epistemic communities, cultures, and communities is so important. And we need for this to have to be open to challenges, etc. And I think this is what we had also from you, Jennifer, when you started directly to say, well, this is what we want for Ghana. But we still have a body of international law, thanks God, and I think there are a number of principles and norms that are almost quasi-universally adopted and respected. And I also have a foot, and more than that, with the International Committee of the Red Cross. And for instance, I think there is still a consensus that the Geneva Conventions represent a minimum of humanity that must be preserved, whatever the circumstances, and we have all to fight for that, whether east, west, south, north, it doesn't matter. And I think we need more of this consensus on the minimal based on international law. the second aspect that for me is important is that we have a number of ground objectives, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel every now and then, but we have to reinterpret them with regard to contemporary challenges. And I think the SDGs were midterm. I wasn't at a meeting in New York where I think the taking stock was very bleak to say we are not yet there, and we won't get there if things do not change radically, and I don't think to change for the better. But still, I think that quite a number of those objectives pave a certain way towards where we want to land. And then we have it's not my own area of expertise, but I think net zero emissions by 2050, which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is saying this is what we need if we want to have 50% of chances of landing at 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. Is a framework which might not be achieved, but is a framework we have to aim for. And this is where I was taking the numbers that I was mentioning on what it would mean to get to net zero by 2050 in terms of redistributions vis-a-vis this huge shift out of fossil fuels towards energy transition minerals. So these are bits and pieces, but I'd like to hear how you see this in Ghana in particular.
I think it's very good we get to the next lawyer, because I think what we've learned now is that no matter what happens in practice, if the law doesn't change in a particular way of how we look at it, then we can't do anything. So,
okay, even though this whole concept of just transition appears to be a Western concept, it doesn't mean that as African countries and we are not open to the underlying principles that undergird the whole concept of just transition. We realize that's actually really good for us also. But then you don't want a situation where we still have the same problem, like Gerda was saying. For instance, you have a company coming into an African country to start a solar company or a wind project. Then they take away the lands of the indigenous people. Then they subject them to certain conditions that they are not able to have their economic livelihood and all of that. If we do not put things in place to ensure that these things that have been occurring for so many years do not actually continue to go on, then at the end of the day, we will be at the losing end still, because for so many years, we've had multinational corporations coming into various African countries to carry out various businesses. But then at the end of the day, we realize that we are still at the losing end. We have a lot of resources, but then because we do not have the capacity and the technological ability to actually put these resources to use, and then also because we do not convert our resources into valuable substances that we could actually make more money from. Because of that, we are not able to mobilize enough revenue. So I believe that we need to, there are already a lot in place in the African context in terms of law. And I even made reference to the whole framework of business and human rights, which is currently not even being implemented. So we need to put all these things in mind, even as we actually implement this whole concept of transition.
I think we're navigating between law, economics, and politics, no? And they have to dialogue together. I'll give one example. It is the ILO 169 convention, no? On the rights of indigenous peoples to be consulted whenever there is a project that affects their resources, land, well-being, etc. So you in these places in the Altiplano where you have indigenous populations, they have been consulted, but concretely, this is the ideal word. Concretely, consultation means they have to travel an entire day to reach the place where the consultation is taking place, and then they have 5 minutes to talk to the company or the government representatives, etc. So this is how things are being done in practice. And why? Because the government needs the money, the royalties of the extraction, and the companies, they need to fight with the others for the resource. So in the end, we need to talk. Why? Because someone's justice may be someone's injustice. So there is an entire question or tension between these converging interests. We need to change things at the global level, climate change, and diverging interests, no? And choices are to be made. So therefore, the supply chain, but the entire transition has to be managed or governed. But the question is, according to what norms? And how do we establish priorities? And according to what criteria? With what governance mechanisms? Who will participate in the decision-making process? And who decides who is going to participate? The market, geostrategic interests, the state, and who will talk for marginalized populations or future generations? These are important questions. And I think Geneva could be a good place to have this discussion, no? But we need to establish a mechanism. We talk about just transition. We have the history, we have things in practice, we have an ideal word. There is what I would like the word to be, and there is concrete things. And what is going on is, you ask the question, is it changing things? No, it is not changing things. It is rude capitalism and selfish interests from people, companies, states that are fighting. If we don't organize things, it will continue as it is now. That is, it's not an ideal word. We're fighting, and many people even doubt that there should be an energy transition, even more for a just energy transition. You have to convince people. I don't know how to, but
I think the how to in Geneva is always quite an infamous question. And well, if we think back at the last year, I would say the one place where they figured it out in a very, very particular area was with WTO and the fisheries. And they found a way of talking to each other again and working through some of the issues. So maybe that's something we can look to. Because I think the Geneva Conventions, we always uphold them, and then forever there's a questions my students sometimes ask me when I teach, and also say this to them as an example. Then they look at me and they say, but you know, if we would try to negotiate something like the Geneva Conventions today, what do you think would happen? So I do think that these are very complex questions that are very difficult to be solved. I saw the hands. I'm gonna just for 1 second give it back to Jara to answer the second question. On the independence within the mechanism.
Yeah, well, they are independent from the organizations. They have independent maneuvering space. So I think that their integrity is quite well established. For example, the independent mechanism of the Green Climate Fund, it can initiate suo motu proceedings. For example, if they know about an NGO report, for example, of violations occurring in a project area of the GCF, they can initiate an investigation. And this was actually the case in the first complaint that was brought at the mechanism. It was initiated by the accountability mechanism itself that went to talk to the community. So I think that the independency requirement is established. Although I think that in my research I also want to test the effectiveness of these mechanisms and the remedies and the response that then the organization gives to the individuals or communities. Thank you for your question.
And I'm guessing you are an online question. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this question is from Edie Blum, and they ask, what if, for example, Chile decides to sit on its lithium resources and the demand is not answered? What would that hamper the transition or just push it towards a different solution with less demand? And also, what would it take for a country to really consider their options from the point of view of their own good? What kind of process would allow and facilitate such strategic thinking?
So I assume the transition meant in the Chile question is on general energy transition. So that I would say is a question directed to Mark, and then the other one is more open. So I'm going to give all of you more time to think about the second question while Mark answers the first.
There is a discussion ongoing in South America in these countries precisely on that. No, what if we would sit on our reserves? That we would create a cartel because they say that 70% of the reserves or lithium reserves are in South America. No, and Australia is a big producer, but it is ending its production. Well, first, there are lithium mines opening everywhere. So now in many countries, I mean, and there are reserves in many places. The question here is economics. That is, the Chilean lithium is cheaper than others. That is why Chile is the second producer of lithium. So what would Chile gain of cutting its supply? Not much, because it's an international globalized system. Even more, Chile has no real interest in doing that because Chile has an open economy. It doesn't do that, will never do that. Maybe, I don't know, Argentina would have tendencies to be more nationalist, or Bolivia even more, but they won't do that because they need the money also. So this is always the same argument, no? You're in an international system, you didn't design and at the national level, you impose those rules on people.
I think
Yeah,
Gilles wanted to come in on this.
I want just to come in on that, because you know everything is bleak, but not sometimes you have a silver lining at the end of the tunnel. Some of us, we have followed with great interest the Yasuni Itete National Park in Ecuador, and we have written several articles at the Graduate Institute about these attempts to say, okay, the Korea government at a certain stage said we are ready to keep the oil underneath the soil in our most biodiverse national park, Yasuni, provided the international community pays us half of what we would receive if we would exploit the oil. And then you had a row about, well, the Germany may fund part of it, but then it will be in a trust fund, either under the UNDP or World Bank. And Korea said, kidding, I mean, it's my money, so bring it directly to. And then it didn't fly, unfortunately. But what is very rejoicing, I think, in terms of news is 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago, they voted on the spot. And a majority of 60% of the people living in the area said, we don't want oil extraction to go on. And the government said, we will respect the result of the vote. And I think this is great because it's a national solution based on democratic. We do the same thing in Switzerland. Why don't they do the same thing in Ecuador? It's to say, okay, you can make a lot of money by exploiting those resources, but do you want that to happen? And okay, the story is not over, but I think it's great that this has happened without any violence, as far as I know. And these are these steps that I think show a greater maturity and that are also providing some solutions which are not that complex. It's much easier than having this trust fund funded and all the arrangements, but it's a sovereign decision by the.
And in a very efficient Swiss manner, Gilles has answered both questions in one, I would say. I still want to hear you from the other panelists, your views on the second question on what would it take to have these types of national processes?
So I strongly believe that for African countries, like I said when I started speaking, that we need to have home solutions to this whole concept of just transition. One of the things that we could rightly do is to involve our people, indigenous people, in the process, consider their interests, and then not have the situation whereby even our governments will be colluding with businesses to take away the rights of the people. And that's also important because not to paint my country black or to paint African countries black, but then there's really the issue of corruption internally. And then until we can address these issues, it will be very difficult for us to actually implement solutions that are national. Because like Mark was saying, we need money. There are so many unconventional financing options that are being implemented nowadays in a lot of African countries. You have resource-backed loans, you have mining companies actually being put in offshore places in order to just monetize our resources. Recently, we're having a discussion on gold for oil, and these are different forms of making money that are being adopted by a lot of African countries. So the problem is because we need money, at the end of the day, we tend to be lenient on our internal regulations and what we need to put in place as African countries to ensure that we benefit from something like just transition. So I really believe that we need to put in place measures. The measures are in place. We need to actually implement them and decide that, okay, that's what we want to do. And then also, we should also think about imposing, I want to use the right word. So when we have companies, multinational companies coming into our country to carry out their operations, we need to implement a bit of hard requirements on them. That's what I believe. We need to implement hard requirements on them so that in carrying out their operations, they are not, they don't just have the leeway to do whatever they want to do and then make money and then go, and at the end of the day, we are still suffering.
Well, I agree with Jennifer, and yeah, I think that the law already has provided the answer. Is a matter of enforcement, but the enforcement is actually very political. Jennifer mentioned that there are issues of corruption between government and private companies, and then the people are suffering in this. They may suffer in the energy extraction and in the transition. So I think it is very important to actually implement what the law says, and especially at the human rights and environmental level, we do have laws in place for the rights of indigenous peoples regarding consultation, regarding consent, which is a very strong requirement. We have procedural participatory rights for the people that can be affected. So the law is there, is really a political will to implement those measures in order to guarantee human rights and also environmental rights.
Sorry, maybe we can collect the three questions and then answer them together. So we start at the back, then the gentleman in the front, and then the lady in the middle. Yeah.
Hi, just thank you to all the presenters. It's really interesting and I'm definitely learning a lot. My name is Alison George and I work for an organization called Development Partner Institute, and it's focused on discussing some of these issues that we're grappling with around defining just transition. My question is, you mentioned corruption. I think when you think about mining and companies and how they come into different global South countries, and you mentioned requirements, and sometimes there isn't that capacity to even monitor what's in place. So when we talk about just transition and all the things it means, do you think there's any scope for just taxation? Because the corruption piece is complex. There's countries where they have managed corruption, and there's other environments where there's mismanaged corruption. I'm talking about being able to collect taxes properly, and I think that gives a little bit of context. So is there any scope for just taxation and requirements to help with moving forward?
Thank you. The gentleman in the front.
This morning, Mr. von Weizsäcker challenged a taboo, saying that we cannot rely on the good people to fight for the good. This afternoon, Mark Höfti has challenged another taboo, saying that someone's justice might be someone else's injustice. So my question goes to Gilles Carbonnier, who still expects so much from the Geneva Hub. Isn't the Geneva Hub, first and foremost, a museum of taboos?
So I think we're going to be here for another couple of hours. Yeah, well, both of you, and then we can go through them.
Hello, and thank you for a very thoughtful conversation so far. My name is Hélène Piaget. I'm interested in going back to the initial introduction to the limiting illicit financial flows, and to ask those who participated in the project, what do you think are the greatest opportunities, because they're challenges maybe, for limiting the scope of illicit financial flows and trying to use that in a practical sense towards a sense of justice, not only transition justice, but general geopolitical transition justice that we see happening at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Magdalena, and I just wanted to offer maybe a little bit of help. I'm from Poland, and I work with just transition. I'm doing field work in Poland, where I focus on communities affected by coal. And it made me think a lot about the language that we use. And it reminded me of the neoliberal transformation that was inflicted on my country and other countries that were formerly referred to as the second world. And we had questions related to corruption. I think it's a very important aspect of this debate. And also to think about how people are affected by it. So what happened in Poland in the 90s was devastating for individuals, for society, and partly because of corruption. So I would basically like to just maybe say the same thing. How do you think it's possible to tackle just transition that is just financially for individuals?
Thank you very much for all the questions. So I think we should start with the question on just taxation and monitoring requirements, which I think it's either a question for Jennifer or for Gilles.
Okay, I think I will take the question of just taxation together with the question on how do we come to grip and curb illicit financial flows and try to have more resource mobilization in low-income countries. And that's a bit where our research is leading to. It's at a time where we have seen this conversation under the G20 and OECD leading to an overall tax reform with basically two pillars, minimum corporate income tax of 15% and the notion of taxation within a multinational group being a bit consistent with where groups have their major activities, personal staff, but also turnover and so forth. And for mineral dependent countries and resource exporting countries, this does not work. You have to find another type of rules and regulations in order to apportion the fair share of taxation to producing countries. And a lot of work is ongoing, I'm sure, at the next IGF conference, which takes place in Geneva. And I think there will be no taboo there in November. It's one of the conversations that we have with also ministers from those countries. Then in terms of what to do, I was mentioning, it's interesting, we run a so-called Q study to understand what are the options out there that are kind of acceptable in principles for most of the stakeholders involved. And the options that seems to be low-hanging fruits are increasing, enhancing transparency over trade transactions related to then taxation. And there are many initiatives underway, and Jennifer could certainly speak about the situation in Ghana. But what we see is that we have also colleagues from Laos, and they say we would need to build our capacities to be able to deal with transfer pricing, the shifting of profits outside of producer countries within multinational groups, where they shift profits to low taxation or zero taxation jurisdiction, not to be taxed in the producer countries. And they don't have the capacities. So there are other solutions which deviate radically from what the OECD has been advocating in terms of transfer pricing rules and regulations. And we have another study that's very interesting that looked at the profile of those OECD experts deciding about the rules, and they often come from the Big Four, and you have the revolving four between the Big Four doing taxation advice for optimization, going to the OECD's experts, etc., and designing rules that are so complex that low-income countries with a lack of capacities are not able to implement that. There are prescriptive methods which are much simpler and would provide predictability to investors, mining companies, governments, and would be very simple to administer. There have been attempts to do so, and there is a legal debate to see whether some of those prescriptive methods would go against stabilization clauses in investment treaties. We have a conversation yesterday to say no, actually, based on fairness consideration, we could argue that it wouldn't violate a number of stabilization clauses, but I think the whole issue of stabilization clauses under investment treaties also needs to be revisited, and the tax expenditure that you have, especially in special economic zones, is also another case in point. So there are a number of things that can be done so that you have more easily administrable rules that can be applied to tax fairly the extraction and exportation of energy transition minerals. So this is maybe for the taxation and fair taxation issues. Then there is the whole loopholes with regard to offshore centers and transparency, the country by country reporting. It's a big debate, but country by country reporting from multinational groups, which would allow a portion and unitary taxation proposals that would allow actually to apportion the fair share of corporate taxes among jurisdictions. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't enter into the intricacies, but I'm fascinated to listen to the conversation among lawyers, which we had yesterday. And the Museum of Taboo, I think it's a great idea. We should open a Museum of Taboo in Geneva and have some solid conversations on the number of them, which keep revolving. We have 160 years of experience as Geneva is a hub for multinational and multilateral conversations. And what is striking when, for instance, I go into the archives of the International Committee of the Red Cross is to see how much a lot of things that appear to be brand inédit, never seen, have been faced by our, grandparents and even before under different guises. And I think we can draw much more in terms of providing a more contemporary interpretation of solutions that have been found at different juncture where the world was also facing a huge crisis. But I think it's an interesting value proposition, and you just have to find the funder to then set up this museum of taboos.
I just wanted to ask Jennifer if you have something to add to some of these points.
Yes, I'll just add that on the bit of just taxation. I believe strongly that we need to, as African countries, limit the way we give tax exemptions to multinational corporations coming into trade. Usually we do these things to attract more foreign direct investments and all of that. But then the situation actually is that when they come in to carry out the operations, they make a lot of money. So whatever we can accrue in terms of taxation, we should be able to accrue it. Also, I also think that there's a need for companies to actually disclose their actual realized income so that we can know what we are getting in terms of corporate income tax, because it's based on the knowledge of what they are getting that we can impose corporate income tax. So there's a need for us to make it a strong legal requirement and actually implement it so that we are able to accrue a lot in terms of taxation.
So I think with that end call for transparency, we can end the session. Thank you very, very much for the audience. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the World Resources Forum for giving us the space and the time to hold this panel. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the forum.